Picture this. You are one of the most hunted men in Italy. There are murder charges with your name on them. The country's most elite law enforcement unit has been searching for you for 3 months straight. And where do you decide to ride it out? Not a bunker, not a remote farmhouse in the hills, not a false passport and a one-way flight to somewhere with no extradition treaty. You pick a luxury villa on the Amalfi Coast, a place where a single night costs more than most Italian families spend in a month. You order room service, you tuck your children into bed, you watch the sun go down over the Mediterranean and convince yourself that you have won. Roberto Mazzarella convinced himself of exactly that. For 94 days, he was right. And then, on the night of April 4th, while Easter weekend wrapped the rest of Europe in a warm, holiday silence, the lights went out on his little seaside fairy tale in about 4 minutes flat. What happened on that cliffside stretch of the Italian coast was not simply the arrest of a dangerous criminal, it was a message, delivered by Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's government to every mafia boss, every fugitive clan leader, every crime dynasty operating anywhere on Italian soil. The message was simple, unmistakable, and long overdue. The patience of the Italian state has officially expired. But here's what the headlines are not telling you. This story goes so much deeper than one man in handcuffs. What happened in that villa was the surface. What is happening underneath it, the corruption inquiry, the identity forgers still at large, the European financial web that nobody wants to name out loud, that is the part of this story that actually matters. And that is exactly where we are going today. Before you can understand why this arrest hit Italy like a thunderclap, you need to understand who Roberto Mazzarella actually is. Because people who only follow international headlines tend to picture the Italian mafia as something out of a Scorsese film. Dramatic, operatic, Sicilian, men in dark suits, olive groves, whispered conversations at long dinner tables. The reality of the Camorra is something entirely different, and in many ways, something far more terrifying. The Camorra is the Neapolitan mafia, rooted in the streets and neighborhoods of Naples and the surrounding Campania region. It has been operating continuously for over 2 centuries. It survived fascism, survived the post-war economic transformation of Italy, survived every major law enforcement crackdown the Italian state has ever thrown at it. And the reason it survived all of those things is the reason it is so uniquely difficult to fight. Unlike the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, which historically operated through a centralized governing structure, the Camorra is built like a living organism. It functions through dozens of semi-independent clans, each with its own territory, its own leadership, its own revenue streams, and its own capacity to adapt and regenerate even after serious disruptions to its structure. Cut off one arm, and the body keeps moving. The Mozzarella clan sits at the commanding height of that organism, not as newcomers, not as upstarts who muscled their way in. They are among the oldest, most deeply embedded criminal dynasties in the entire Camorra ecosystem, with roots stretching back generations into the eastern districts of Naples, neighborhoods like San Giovanni, Ateduccio, and Barra, where the Italian state has historically arrived late, stayed briefly, and left without solving much. In those neighborhoods, the Mozzarella clan did not merely operate as criminals, they functioned as a shadow government. They collected what amounted to taxation from local businesses. They resolved disputes that residents did not dare bring to official courts. They controlled the construction economy, the labor market, the flow of cash through local commerce. When Roberto Mazzarella rose to lead this structure, he did not inherit a gang. He inherited an institution, one that had been operating continuously before his grandfather was born and was designed to outlast him entirely. The murder charges that eventually forced Roberto underground in January 2025 are not peripheral accusations. Italian prosecutors spent years, not months, years, building a case that places him not as a distant figurehead giving vague instructions to people he could later disavow, but as an operationally active director of violence, a boss who gave specific orders for specific killings in the context of a brutal ongoing territorial conflict with rival Camorra factions. The evidence assembled to support those charges includes years of wire intercepts, the testimony of former associates who chose cooperation over prison, and surveillance material gathered across operations that cost the Italian taxpayer enormous sums and demanded extraordinary patience from the investigators who ran them. When the arrest warrant arrived in early 2025, Roberto Mazzarella looked at it, presumably considered his options, and disappeared. 94 days. That number deserves to sit with you for a moment. For 3 months, a man wanted on murder charges, a man whose face was known to every serious law enforcement officer in Italy, lived openly, not in hiding, not in deprivation, but in comfort. Extraordinary comfort. moving between locations under a false identity so expertly constructed that it passed hotel check-ins, routine administrative inquiries, and the casual scrutiny of the wealthy, security-conscious world he was moving through. His wife was with him. His children were with him. To the staff of the luxury properties he occupied, to the other guests sitting around the same pool, to anyone who noticed the well-dressed family enjoying what appeared to be an extended, well-funded holiday, Roberto Mazzarella was simply a prosperous Italian man taking his family on vacation. Nothing remarkable, nothing to report. This is a tactic with deep psychological intelligence behind it. Every instinct trained into law enforcement tells officers to look for signs of fear, signs of deprivation, signs of someone trying not to be seen. The hunted man who moves nervously, who keeps his head down, who stays in cheap accommodation far from crowds. Mozzarella inverted every one of those assumptions. He put himself in the most visible, most photographed, most monitored tourist corridor in the country and trusted that the sheer improbability of it would function as camouflage. For 3 months, it worked. The Amalfi Coast, for those unfamiliar, is not a quiet backwater. It is a UNESCO World Heritage coastline packed with international visitors, surveillance infrastructure, hotel security systems, and the kind of ambient attention that comes with being one of the most documented places on Earth. In high season, its narrow cliff roads are gridlocked with hire cars and tourist buses. The hotels range from charming to stratospherically expensive. The entire stretch operates at a level of visibility that most fugitives would find genuinely terrifying. For Mozzarella, that visibility was the strategy, and it nearly worked. What ended the strategy was the Raggruppamento Operativo Speciale, the ROS, the Carabinieri's most elite and most secretive organized crime unit, built on principles that borrow as much from military special operations as from conventional policing. If you follow Italian law enforcement history at all, you know this unit by its trophies. These are the men who ran down Salvatore Riina, the most feared Cosa Nostra boss of the 20th century, after he spent 23 years as a ghost. The ROS does not do rushed operations. It does not act on hunches. It builds cases with the slow, methodical patience of people who understand that the goal is not simply to arrest someone, but to make the arrest irrefutable, unappealable, and devastating to the network around the target, not just to the target themselves. By the time April arrived, the ROS had been quietly, invisibly tightening around Mozzarella for weeks. Surveillance assets had confirmed his presence at the villa in Vietri sul Mare. The Easter holiday was chosen as the operational window not by accident, but by calculation. A holiday crowd on a famous coastline provides natural cover for the kind of discreet movement that a large-scale carabinieri operation requires. Unmarked vehicles blend in. Plainclothes personnel are invisible among tourists. At midnight on April 4th, the commandos moved. 4 minutes. From the moment the perimeter of that luxury villa was breached to the moment Roberto Mozzarella was restrained and in custody, 4 minutes passed. 94 days of freedom, of room service and cliff-top sunsets, and the casual arrogance of a man who believed the state had given up, ended in the time it takes to make a cup of coffee. The precision of the operation was not coincidental. It was the result of the kind of sustained, unglamorous intelligence work that never makes the news while it is happening, that produces no dramatic updates or viral footage, that simply grinds forward in silence until the moment arrives. And when that moment arrived, it was over before Mozzarella had time to process what was happening. But here is where most of the coverage stopped. The arrest was made, the photographs circulated, Meloni released her statement, and the news cycle began its familiar pivot toward whatever came next. What actually unfolded in the 48 hours following that midnight operation tells a far more consequential story. Within 2 days of the Amalfi Coast arrest, coordinated carabinieri operations across the broader Naples metropolitan area produced the detention of 11 additional individuals, not random associates, carefully identified components of the Mozzarella clan's operational infrastructure, financial intermediaries who moved money between legitimate-appearing businesses and the clan's actual revenue, logistical support personnel who kept the network functioning during Roberto's flight, low-level enforcement figures whose names had been sitting in prosecutors' files for years, waiting for exactly this moment. The asset seizures that accompanied those arrests gave the operation its full economic weight. 3 properties in San Giovanni a Teduccio, assessed together at approximately 2.3 million euros, were taken by the state. Nearly €500,000 in physical cash, carefully distributed across multiple locations in denomination choices specifically designed to stay below the thresholds that trigger automatic banking alerts, was recovered. 2 luxury vehicles operating under shell company registrations were impounded. 7 bank accounts connected to what had appeared on paper to be an entirely legitimate chain of construction subcontractors were formally frozen. That construction subcontractor network is worth pausing on because it illustrates something fundamental about the modern Camorra that makes it so much harder to fight than the version people imagine when they think about Italian organized crime. The clan's revenue does not flow through obvious criminal channels that investigators can simply identify and intercept. It flows through businesses that file tax returns, employ registered workers, hold legitimate contracts, and present every superficial appearance of legal commerce. The criminality is buried inside the accounting, inside the ownership structures, inside the decisions about which contracts get awarded to which subcontractors and why. Dismantling it requires forensic financial expertise of the highest order applied over years of patient analysis. The evidentiary foundation underlying all of these arrests and seizures represents exactly that kind of work. Prosecutors in Naples have been assembling this case since late 2021. The documentation they have gathered, the wire transcripts, the financial forensic analysis, the property records, the corporate registration trails, runs to more than 34,000 pages. That figure is not a bureaucratic triviality. It represents years of institutional commitment from investigators who kept working long after the headlines about the Mozzarella clan faded, long after the political pressure that typically drives law enforcement prioritization moved on to something newer and more urgent. 34,000 pages is what genuine, sustained institutional will to dismantle a criminal organization actually looks like on paper. Giorgia Meloni understood immediately what this arrest meant politically, and to her credit, she did not waste it. Within hours of Roberto Mazzarella's detention being confirmed, the Italian Prime Minister released a statement that was carefully worded to carry maximum resonance with an Italian public that has spent decades watching governments declare war on organized crime and then quietly retreat when the difficulty of that war became politically inconvenient. She described the operation as proof that the Italian state does not bow before organized crime. 6 words that, in the context of Italian political history, carry the weight of entire eras of failed confrontation. Interior Minister Matteo Piantedosi followed that statement with substance. An additional 47 million euros in operational funding allocated to the ROS and equivalent units over the following 18 months, specifically designated for fugitive tracking and financial disruption operations targeting the Camorra in Campania, the 'Ndrangheta in Calabria, and Cosa Nostra in Sicily. In the context of Italy's chronically constrained domestic security budget, 47 million euros directed at a single operational priority is a serious commitment. It is the kind of commitment that sends a signal not just to the press, but to the investigators themselves, who have historically operated, knowing that resources could be cut, redirected, or eliminated whenever political winds shifted. The signal being sent here is that the political winds have, at least for now, stopped shifting. And for the men and women who run the ROS, who run the Naples Anti-Mafia Prosecutor's Office, who have spent careers building cases that sometimes took decades to produce results, that signal matters enormously. But Meloni's political moment cuts in 2 directions simultaneously, and her government would be foolish not to recognize the edge on the other side of this blade. Here is the part of this story that should concern everyone watching. Roberto Mazzarella lived for 94 days under a false identity, not a crude fake, not a borrowed name with forged paperwork that would collapse under serious scrutiny. A sophisticated, layered false identity that passed the kind of routine verification checks that luxury hotels, property managers, and administrative systems routinely apply to guests and clients. It held, consistently, for 3 months, in one of the most watched tourist regions in Europe. That level of identity construction does not happen at street level. It does not come from a forger working out of a rented apartment with a scanner and a laminating machine. It requires access to official systems, civil registration databases, national identification infrastructure, the kind of administrative architecture that is not accessible from outside the institutions that maintain it. To build the identity Roberto Mazzarella was using, someone needed to be inside. Investigators know this. They knew it before the arrest. Investigative journalist Marco Linguardi, reporting for the Naples-based outlet Il Mattino on April 6th, confirmed that prosecutors had simultaneously opened a parallel inquiry, designated under Italian law as a corruption and abuse of office investigation. That designation is not procedural housekeeping. Under Italian criminal procedure, it requires a threshold of evidence sufficient to satisfy a preliminary judge that there are reasonable grounds to believe a crime involving a public official has occurred. You do not open a corruption inquiry of that classification on a hunch. You open it when you already have something. The fact that this parallel investigation was opened simultaneously with the arrest, not as a follow-on development but as a concurrent move, strongly implies that investigators identified the identity network before Roberto Mazzarella was taken into custody. They knew someone on the inside helped build his cover. They may already know who that person is. And if they know, the question that no official press conference has yet addressed is why that person has not been arrested alongside him. What are they watching for? What else does that thread connect to? In Italy, the concept of the colluser carries a weight that visitors to the country and foreign observers of Italian politics consistently underestimate. The colluser is the institutional insider who serves two hierarchies simultaneously. The official who draws a state salary, holds a position of public trust, and quietly ensures that certain dangerous people remain protected from the consequences of their actions. The bureaucrat, the officer, the administrator who opens a door, looks the other way at a critical moment, or manipulates a database entry in a way that costs nothing visible but protects everything that matters to the people paying for the service. Italy has not simply experienced this phenomenon. It has documented it, prosecuted it, and paid for its consequences in ways that are written into the DNA of the country's modern political consciousness. The assassinations of anti-mafia judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in 1992, carried out with explosive devices of a sophistication that could not have been deployed without serious logistical support and advance intelligence about the target's movements, remain the defining trauma of Italy's relationship with organized crime and institutional corruption simultaneously. Those murders did not happen because the mafia was powerful enough to act alone. They happened because somewhere inside the system, someone talked. Someone passed information. Someone ensured that the judges' security at critical moments was precisely insufficient. If the parallel corruption inquiry currently running alongside the Mozzarella case leads, where some investigators apparently believe it leads, the implications extend well beyond one fugitive boss and his forged documents. They potentially reach into the functioning of Italian public administration in ways that no government, not Meloni's, not any previous one, is likely to be eager to expose. And yet the exposure, if it comes, may be unavoidable, because the investigation has its own momentum now. The arrest of Mozzarella was not the end of a chapter. It was the opening move in a sequence that investigators have been planning for significantly longer than the public was aware. There is one final dimension to this story that the official narratives on both sides of the political debate have been conspicuously reluctant to engage with directly. Roberto Mozzarella was arrested on Italian soil, but the criminal organization he led was not, by any meaningful definition, an Italian organization operating within Italian borders. It was a European enterprise, one that had extended its financial architecture across multiple EU member states with a sophistication that reflects both the Camorra's evolving operational intelligence and the structural vulnerabilities of the post-Schengen European financial system. Documents filed with the Naples prosecutor's office, reviewed by investigators and partially disclosed through court proceedings, confirm that the ROS operation, which tracked Mozzarella to Vietri sul Mare, involved formal intelligence sharing with Europol's Serious and Organized Crime Center, as well as bilateral coordination with law enforcement counterparts in at least two additional EU member states where the Mozzarella clan's financial network had been traced. The specific countries involved have not been publicly identified. What has been identified through the 4-year financial forensic investigation running parallel to the criminal case is the outline of a cross-border money management architecture of considerable sophistication. Real estate investments in Spain, funneling clan revenue into assets that appreciate in value and can eventually be liquidated as legitimate profit. Shell company structures registered in Luxembourg, exploiting that country's historically permissive corporate registration environment to create ownership layers that make tracing ultimate beneficial ownership genuinely difficult. Cash distribution networks operating through import-export businesses in the Belgian port city of Antwerp, which has long been identified by European law enforcement as a critical transit point for organized crime financial flows. None of these structures are unique to the Mozzarella clan. They represent the standard operating playbook of sophisticated European organized crime in the post-2000 era. The same tools are used by Russian criminal networks, by Balkan trafficking organizations, by West African fraud syndicates that have established European footholds. The common denominator is the exploitation of exactly the freedoms that make the European single market function as a legitimate economic zone. Open borders, harmonized financial regulations, mutual recognition of corporate structures. The same features that allow a legitimate business to operate seamlessly across 12 countries allow an illegitimate one to do the same, with the added advantage that the proceeds look increasingly indistinguishable from lawful commerce by the time they emerge on the other side. Roberto Mazzarella's arrest was an Italian success, but the organization he built is a European problem. And the European institutions nominally responsible for monitoring and disrupting exactly this kind of cross-border criminal financial infrastructure will need to reckon, eventually, with the question of why the Italian investigators, who took 4 years to document it, found so little institutional support from those European monitoring frameworks in the process. With Roberto Mazzarella in custody and facing a trial that will rest on 34,000 pages of meticulously assembled evidence, with 11 associates detained and millions in assets frozen, with a parallel corruption inquiry running quietly in the background, and with additional operations apparently nearing completion against at least 3 other high-priority fugitives on Italy's active most wanted list, it would be tempting to characterize this moment as a turning point. Tempting, but incomplete. The Mozzarella clan did not survive 2 centuries of Italian state power by depending on any single individual. Roberto's arrest removes him from the operational picture. It does not remove the clan's territorial control in eastern Naples. It does not dissolve the financial networks his organization spent decades constructing. It does not automatically produce successors who are less capable or less ruthless. Somewhere in those neighborhoods, conversations are already happening. Decisions are being made about who steps into the leadership vacuum, who goes quiet until the immediate pressure passes, who gets positioned as a sacrificial explanation for things that cannot otherwise be accounted for. This is the institutional resilience of the Camorra, and it is why the ROS and the Naples prosecutor's office frame their work not in terms of individual arrests, but in terms of generational attrition. You do not win against an organization like this in a single operation, however spectacular. You win by making the cost of leadership intolerably high over time, by ensuring that every boss who steps up knows they are stepping into crosshairs that are already calibrated, by building evidentiary files so comprehensive that when someone does eventually stand before a court, the verdict is not in question. That work is ongoing. The 47 million euros in new funding ensures that it continues with the resource base it requires. The parallel corruption inquiry ensures that the protective architecture around fugitive clan leaders, the insider networks that make 94 days of luxury hiding possible, is being dismantled alongside the clans themselves. Giorgia Meloni has her moment. She has earned the right to stand in front of cameras and say that on her government's watch, one of Italy's most wanted men was pulled out of a luxury villa on one of the world's most beautiful coastlines and handed over to the justice he had been evading for 3 months. That is a real achievement. The RO's commandos who executed that operation in 4 precise minutes deserve every word of recognition they are receiving. But Roberto Mazzarella was one man. The Camorra is not one man. The corruption network that built his false identity is not one person's project. The European financial infrastructure that laundered his clan's revenue across 3 countries is not an Italian problem with an Italian solution. The most dangerous chapter of this story did not end on the night of April 4th. It may only just be beginning, and the measure of whether this arrest truly represents the turning point that Meloni's government wants it to be will not be found in the headlines of this week. It will be found in what happens in the months that follow, in whether the corruption inquiry produces names, in whether the financial networks get genuinely dismantled or simply reorganized under new ownership, in whether the 3 fugitives reportedly in the final phase of active surveillance are arrested and who they turn out to be. Italy caught its man. The harder question, the question that matters most, is what Italy does with everything it learned about how he stayed hidden for so long. Because that knowledge is either the beginning of something genuinely transformative, or it is another chapter in the long, painful Italian story of opportunities that arrived, shone brightly for a moment, and then quietly dissolved into the same institutional inertia that made them necessary in the first place. The handcuffs went on at midnight. The real work started the morning after.